I want to talk about another topic today. Because I want to be honest. Ukraine is not the only place in the country where there is a struggle for freedom going on right now. It isn't. The amount of media attention it's getting, deserved media attention, mind you. It is a fight for a people's independence against an invading power trying to stamp out a democracy, and an attempted regime change war as they try to basically make Ukraine come to heel, saying you will be part of our influence, you will be controlled by us, you're not allowed to join economic blocs like the European Union that are not aligned with us. But besides that, there are other struggles for independence that I think need proper attention and is not getting the proper attention. And one of that is one that's been going on for well over a year now, since there was a military coup against the democratically elected government of Aung San Suu Kyi. And that is people in Myanmar fighting against the government. In Myanmar, there have been ethnic militias and fighting against the government for a very long time, because the government of Myanmar, specifically the military of Myanmar, because the military has a lot of influence in Myanmar, because it used to, and now again, is controlled by a military junta. Basically, the military controls the country. And they were genociding the Rohingya Muslims. And eventually, after Aung San Suu Kyi and many activists struggled for democracy, and they were able to attain a partial democracy. That's an important fact, a partial democracy in Myanmar, where basically there was mostly elected representatives, but a certain amount of representatives in their, what is basically a parliament, were automatically just allotted to the military and military-aligned parties. And the military thought that with this constitution that guaranteed them certain cabinet positions, guaranteed them basic certain positions in government and seats without having to win these seats in election, they could keep a stranglehold on power to a strong degree. And in order to change the constitution to reduce the military's power, you would need to have, I believe, I'm trying to remember the numbers. You would need to have, I think, around 70 or 80% of the vote. And automatically, the military has about 20 to 30% of the seats in their parliament automatically, without elections. Basically meaning you would have to convince the military in order to make them give up their political power, which, for obvious reasons, is not going to happen, right? But they lost another election because the military is not nearly as popular as they would want to be, and Aung San Suu Kyi's party is immensely popular because Aung San Suu Kyi, even with her problems when it comes to the Rohingya community, is immensely popular in Myanmar due to her struggle for democracy. Well, the military did not like this, and they overthrew the government. This was in February of last year. It's been over a year since the coup has happened. There was a lot of attention to it. Everybody talked about it. And then, poof, dialogue about Myanmar disappeared. You didn't see it on media coverage anymore. You didn't see it in dialogue anymore. You didn't see really much talk of it whatsoever. Does that mean that there's no struggle for democracy in Myanmar? No. There have been a ton of protests in Myanmar. There have been a ton of people protesting against the government, and the government has responded violently. They've mowed down protesters. They've killed tons of protesters. And not only have they killed tons of protesters, but more people, more than ever, have been picking up arms against the government. In fact, some analysts say that 1/3 of the country is controlled by rebels. To be clear, this isn't like one rebel group. It's a tie of pro-democracy rebels, ethnic rebels, and a bunch of different rebels control different parts of the country. It's not like city centers, but in the jungles of the country. But that's more than it has been historically. The amount of IED attacks and attacks on military convoys, military outposts have spiked as more young people, traditionally who were in the city centers and stuff, have gone out into the jungle to join the rebellion. In fact, this is a Myanmar beauty queen who won competitions, who actually joined the rebellion to help fight for the struggle for democracy. And so I made a tweet, it got a tiny bit of traction, saying that the same energy everyone has for defending democracy and sovereignty in Ukraine should be equally shared with the rebels fighting against the fascist military junta in Myanmar. And I 100% believe that. I wish every single person fighting against the military junta in Myanmar good aim and a steady hand as they fight against the dictatorship. Because the thing is, this guy deserves, who is currently the dictator of Myanmar, deserves a present with a timer on it for Christmas. I'm going to be completely honest. And people in Myanmar are still dying fighting the dictatorship. Here is a person, a young person, because a lot more young people are joining the rebellion ever since the military was overthrown, who was recently killed while fighting the military junta. And it's not like this is the only, like, and like, here's him with his girlfriend, you know, a young couple fighting against a military dictatorship. He's fighting against the government. He's fighting against the military junta. Brave, and he died doing it. But it's not getting the same attention as Ukrainian Air Force pilots getting shot down, Ukrainian soldiers getting killed. And he deserves that same recognition. These soldiers deserve the same respect, in my opinion at least, because they're fighting for democracy just as hard as the people in Ukraine are. And let's see if I can find some footage. And like, there's a bunch of combat footage coming out of Myanmar circulating online that isn't getting the same attention. For example, Popular Front, great podcast. I recommend you guys go and listen to Popular Front. Here is footage of an ambush against a Myanmar military convoy of the military junta, fighting and killing 5 government soldiers. Now, you don't see anybody die in this footage, but this type of footage of just a straight up ambush is not being shared around, even though it's being shoved out by these people, and they're asking for it to be shared around on social media. They're asking for it to be posted on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, to be shared by mainstream media outlets as the government shuts down independent news in Myanmar for trying to show stuff like this, for trying to show that the government is mowing down protesters, for trying to show that the military has committed genocide against the Rohingya Muslims, for trying to show their violation of people's civil rights and the arrests in the middle of the night as they raid opposition leaders' homes and take them away, as they try to commit war crime after war crime after war crime against civilians in Myanmar. And they want to show that there's people out there right now fighting the good fight, the justified fight against the military dictatorship. I'll say this, and I don't care if it gets me banned from Myanmar or whatever, even though I'd love to go there one day. I hope these rebels get their hands on every single person who orchestrated that coup, and I'm against the death penalty, but by God, I'd make an exception in this case because the people who led it are fucking bastards who deserve a bullet. Unironically. And then they go back into the grass to set up another ambush or resupply. Let me also say, I think a lot of people on the left, and this is weird because a lot of it's from like the revolutionary socialist left, they're like pacifists, you know? They're so used to like, you know, like condemning like stuff like the Iraq War. I also condemn, right? And so like the idea of like having to use violence for political means in any capacity is like so like against their aspect, of course. Especially, and this is just true, and this affects the left as well, especially if they're brown. If it's a white Ukrainian soldier fighting against an invading Russian, we can all see why we should clap that along, except for a few wackos on the left, right? And a few wackos on the right as well. We can all see why we need to clap that along and wish them good luck against that fight. But once you're a rebel fighting against an authoritarian government, shooting and doing ambushes like this, justified ambushes against the military that's slaughtering and doing genocides and killing and maiming civilians and violating the Constitution and taking away a democracy, the little bit of a democracy they're able to obtain, oh no, there must just protest. And you should protest. They should protest, but they should also have a rifle to meet those soldiers as well, because those soldiers are mowing down protesters. They don't have a peaceful solution. They're airstriking ethnic minorities and mowing down protesters, okay? There is no peaceful solution to what's going on in Myanmar. The solution, right, is either the threat of rebellion that'll put them in a position where they have to negotiate, so the threat of violence and or actual violence to overthrow the government. That is the only solution here. But because the people are brown, let's be honest, it's not getting the same coverage because it's not in Europe, and to some degree, because, you know, some people are just pacifistic in nature, right? I support them fighting the military. I hope they have good aim. I hope in this drive-by, they hit a few. And I don't care how that makes me look. We can't, as Americans, be like, yes, rebellion against the British, so based. But then after we do it, no one else can do it. It's ridiculous. I think you're exaggerating the role of skin color. I will say, I just want to point that out because I do think it's present. There are other things that come into it as well. Zelensky is an amazing public speaker, and I think he was able to get international attention on this as well. There's no nuclear weapons involved in this rebellion. You could say China is involved in supporting the military junta, and it's absolutely horrific, but this isn't like, there's not like a power directly invading that's involved with nuclear weapons and raising nuclear readiness levels. The Ukrainians have an amazing PR team and digital like media team at their disposal, right? It's easier to probably get reporters into certain parts of Ukraine than it is to get into the jungles of Myanmar, due to the fact that the government in Myanmar would hate reporters covering this, and they're going out and actively arresting reporters that cover this. While in Ukraine, the people arresting civilians are the Russian invaders in Melitopol, and in the south, arresting mayors and arresting activists, etc., right? And blasting propaganda. So there's other factors involved too. I will agree. But also, it's not also, I do think this is a part of it, it's not in America's security interests. We did sanction, I do support Biden sanctioning the military and military officials. I support that. I 100% do. Because that's what the protesters were asking for as well. Was for these military officials and the military to be sanctioned. Because the military have military companies in Myanmar that help supply their genocide, that help supply them mowing down protesters. And I support that. But I do believe race and geographic do play a certain role here. And I think the reason why we're seeing a strong American response from the American government is we're seeing more of a call, because number one, geopolitical importance to American geostrategic planners, number one. Two, I do think race plays a factor. And three, not enough PR. And I do also think that there's a certain aspect of it where people are like, oh, war in Europe, but that's not supposed to happen. But this is one of those third world countries. This is common, so it's not as much to be reported on. Anyway, I wanted to make this segment because I wanted to just highlight to everyone that just because the news has stopped covering it, right? Just because your favorite commentators no longer care or no longer talking about it, doesn't mean it stops. And even if I will say, I think I'm partially at fault too. Because the way I get news and information is I'll go out there, I'll see what's being talked about, and those ideas will get in my head, and I'll start talking about it. And if the news isn't talking about Myanmar that much, or they're not giving me updates, I'm going to have to go out of my way to get updates about Myanmar. I got to go out of my way to get updates about Syria. I got to go out of my way to get updates about the famine going on in Afghanistan. And our participation to make that currently the situation. The Taliban did it through their own pathetic mismanagement in large part, but also our holding of certain assets that should be in its entirety going to Afghanistan to help with that famine. Or the blockade on Yemen. The American blockade on Yemen, it was probably one of America's biggest failures, is our continuance of helping the Saudi blockade. Right? It's not in America's geostrategic interests, so it's not talked about as much. And therefore, since it's not talked about as much, it doesn't get to me. The information doesn't get to me to the same levels in Ukraine, where it does get the same level of information. But there's other factors involved, and I will acknowledge that as well, yes. Accessibility to interviews, not to mention the prevalence of more English speakers in Ukraine, etc. Anyway, I wanted to end tonight's program by talking about this, because I believe it deserves the coverage. And I wanted to make sure to remind you guys that there is still this going on in Myanmar, and you should all be supporting the rebels taking on the government and wishing them good aim.